Hey guys, it's Yuta. So, many people think Japanese is a difficult language because they spend 300 hours watching hololive VTubers and still not fluent. But is Japanese really that hard? I'm gonna break this down into a few elements because languages are complex things. First, pronunciation. Fortunately, Japanese pronunciation is easy if you aim for a passable level. It's definitely easier for English speakers to have passable Japanese pronunciation than for Japanese speakers to have passable English pronunciation. Just ask random Japanese people to say the word world. ちなみにさっきの world 発音してもらっていいですか？
わあ無理。できない、そういうのはできない。
World.
ワールド。
But if I asked you to say some Japanese words, your pronunciation will probably be good enough. So repeat after me. 仕事 work おいしい delicious 斜め75度の並びで泣く泣くいななく七半七台難なく並べて長々め Very easy. Of course, if you want to go beyond the passable level and pronounce words properly, it's going to be a little more difficult. For example, many people have trouble telling the difference between sensha, car wash, and sensha, tank. They just have different pitch patterns. Sensha is low, high, high, and sensha is high, low, low. But if you're not used to this, it might be a little bit difficult. But even if you mix up these pitch patterns, which most learners do, we can probably more or less understand you from the context. Personally, I really appreciate people who take their time to learn pitch accent because I feel like they respect the language. But it's also a viable choice to ignore it and settle with passable pronunciation, just like some people settle with their imperfect 3D wife because their perfect 2D waifu isn't real. Either way, pronunciation isn't going to be a critical problem. But how about vocabulary? Part of the reason why Japanese sounds a little bit difficult is that many words sound very different from English words. For example, if I say, J'ai étudié la littérature anglaise à l'université, you can probably guess more or less what it means even if you don't speak French. But if I say, 大学で英文学を勉強した, you probably can't guess what it means unless maybe you know how to read Chinese. So with Japanese, you just have to learn many words from scratch. But not every word is going to be completely new because we also use many English words. For example, if I say, リンクをクリックしてユータの日本語レッスンに登録しよう You can probably understand some words like link, click, and lessons because they are English words. And if you know 日本語 means Japanese, you can understand that I said click the link and subscribe to Yuta's Japanese lessons. So, if you want to learn Japanese with me, I will teach you the kind of Japanese that real-life Japanese people today actually speak, which can be different from the kind of Japanese that textbooks teach you because they can be unnatural and old-fashioned. So click the link in the description and subscribe. Anyway, even though remembering Japanese words may feel a little bit difficult initially, that doesn't mean the language itself is difficult. It's just different. In terms of grammar, Japanese is no more difficult than English. For example, let's say you are eating ramen and it's good. In English, you can use the word good and say, this ramen is good. Now, if you are looking at somebody else who's eating ramen and you think it's good, you can say, that ramen looks good, using the verb to look instead of to be. This is grammar. If you know this piece of grammar, you can make sentences like, it looks fun. He looks kind. I stayed up all night long playing an otome game and I look like shit this morning. Very useful, right? And you can do a similar thing in Japanese. If food is good, you can say, おいしい. When food looks good, you can replace I with so and say, おいしそう. It looks good. That's it. Pretty easy. Now you can understand this scene.
メロンソーダおいしそう
Grammar is like that. Just remember a bunch of these rules, and with decent vocabulary, you will be able to understand a lot of Japanese. Of course, there are some subtle concepts that are not easy for non-native speakers to grasp, but it's not just Japanese. English also has concepts that are not easy for Japanese people to understand. For example, articles and nouns. If I have one book, I have to say, I have a book. If I have two books, I have to say, I have books. If I say, I have book, that will be grammatically incorrect. How about the word advice? Advice is an uncountable noun, so you can only give advice. You can't give an advice, or you can't give advices unless you're talking about some types of documents, as in remittance advices. But you can give as many tips as you want because tip is a countable noun. You can just give one tip, or you can give 300 tips. This is already tricky for Japanese people. But then you have nouns that can both be countable and uncountable. For example, space. If you say, I have enough space in my room for my educational Blu-ray collection, it means your room has enough capacity for your educational collection, and it doesn't matter how many places you have to store your collection. It can just be one bookshelf, and that's it. But if you say, I have several spaces in my room for my educational Blu-ray collection, it means you may have several places for your collection. Maybe you have a bookshelf for showcasing your good taste, but you also have another place under the bed for ones that are strictly for your personal academic research. So they have different nuances, and these things are obvious for native speakers, but for Japanese speakers, they can be quite elusive because Japanese doesn't have singular or plural forms, and we don't have articles either. You can find many Japanese people who have been living in English-speaking countries for years, if not for decades, and still don't quite get these concepts. English can be quite tricky, but Japanese also has some concepts such as particles that are often quite tricky for English speakers. For example, many people struggle with using wa and ga correctly. Let me give you some sentences using these particles. I'll also use 今日 today, 暑い hot, 気温 temperature, 高い high. Pay attention to wa and ga. 今日は暑い It's hot today. 今日は気温が高い The temperature is high today. 今日の気温は高い Today's temperature is high. 今日の気温が高いのは意外だよ It's unexpected that today's temperature is high. And many non-native speakers have trouble using these particles correctly in the right situations. But here's the thing. Whether it's Japanese particles or English articles, it's not going to be a huge problem if you don't get them right because we can probably understand you from the context. If I say, I have many informations about content of your secret hard disk drive, it's going to be grammatically incorrect, but you can understand me and you will be more concerned about the content of my sentence than the grammatical errors. Japanese particles are the same. So things like particles don't necessarily make Japanese more difficult than English when it comes to reaching a conversational level. But there's one thing about Japanese that makes it a little more difficult than most languages, and that is the writing system. Japanese has an official list of about 2,000 kanji that are commonly used. So if you want to read Japanese smoothly, you will have to remember most of these letters. And that's a lot. Japanese people spend 6 years of elementary education to learn half of these kanji. But it's not as intimidating as you may think because the more you learn, the easier it gets. For example, most kanji are just combinations of other kanji. Onna, woman. Ie, house. And if you remember these kanji, it will be easy to remember yome, wife, because women are supposed to be in kanji is totally not sexist. And since many of you guys have a waifu instead of wife, how about this story? The anime woman in my house is my waifu. And the next time you see this kanji, you will remember your waifu. And this type of memory technique is called a mnemonic. So remembering kanji isn't actually remembering thousands of random letters. There's definitely patterns. You can also see that kanji that share the same components tend to have related meanings. 食べる to eat, 飯 meal, 飢える to starve. So learning kanji may not be as hard as you think. Overall, Japanese isn't necessarily inherently more difficult than any other languages. If it feels difficult, it's probably simply because it's different. So, don't be discouraged if you want to learn Japanese. And if you want to learn Japanese with me, I will teach you the kind of Japanese the real-life Japanese people today actually speak. So click the link and subscribe to my email group, Japanese with Yuta. Alright, see you guys soon. Ciao, ciao!